Hamas and the extreme elements of Hamas don't represent all the Palestinian people.
I think none of those concerns are anything that we can't address. So I feel good about where we're at.
We're up about 12 or 14 points in Iowa and crooked Joe Biden.
Hello, I'm Ed O'Keefe in Washington. Welcome to America Decides and another busy week here in your nation's capital and around the world. Thousands of Israeli troops are staged along the border with Gaza ahead of an expected ground offensive. Both sides continued trading rocket fire today like they have since the war broke out. The near constant bombardment comes as the humanitarian crisis in Gaza worsens. Officials say hospitals in the region are almost out of basic necessities. And in Tel Aviv today, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken reiterated his support for Israel while meeting with the Israeli Secretary of Defense.
You know our deep commitment to Israel's right, indeed its obligation, to defend itself and to defend its people. And in that, you have and will always have the support of the United States.
CBS News foreign correspondent Ian Lee joins us now from Tel Aviv. Ian, good to see you. What is the latest we're hearing on a potential ground invasion?
Hi, Ed. Yeah, that's the thing that everyone is waiting for. It could happen at any moment. Likely, the Israelis are not going to tell us it happens when it happens. I can remember back in 2014 when that ground invasion started. The Israelis didn't tell anyone until hours after it had begun. But we saw on the horizon it light up with explosions, with bullets, with missiles being fired. And that was the indicator that that war, that ground invasion had started. And that's likely what's going to happen again. People seeing a real increase in the fighting in Gaza as they launch their ground invasion, Ed.
And to be clear, the missiles, the rockets have been fired from both sides of this ever since it began last weekend. It's more now we're waiting for the explicit ground portion of the conflict to intensify. I know throughout the day there, you've been hearing sirens blaring, not only in Tel Aviv, but across Israel, really. What have you seen? And are everyday Israelis still heeding those warnings and seeking shelter every time they go off?
You know, what's interesting, Ed, is, being here versus being in Israel versus being in Ukraine, both places have air raid sirens go off. Here in Israel, when those sirens go off, it's usually because that a very specific area is under threat of being hit by a rocket, by a missile. And so most people do heed those warnings, go into a bomb shelter, and you see the roads empty out, people going into the ditches next to road or going into a building, unlike in Ukraine, where people have been so used to the air raid sirens that they kind of ignore them. But those are large swaths of area. Here in Israel, very small. And actually, we can usually hear the Iron Dome system intercepting those rockets when they're being fired. Ed?
And down in Gaza, of course, thousands of people are heading to its south, including Americans who are now trying to get to safe passage into Egypt. What is the latest regarding the Rafah border crossing, which is that spot between Gaza and Egypt where people are able to cross?
Yeah, that's really the only lifeline that Gaza has right now, the only place that humanitarian aid can get through. And there has been a lot of back and forth between the diplomats from Egypt, the United States, Israel, and other nations trying to get that corridor really open so people can get out, those people who have Western passports or foreign passports can get out through that crossing, but also, more crucially, get that aid into the country. And just to give you an idea, a lot of hospitals are saying they're running out of fuel. They have hours left. That fuel goes away. Their generators go down. They lose electricity. People could die. You also have food that people need to eat, water, other medical supplies. It's really critical that these supplies get in and that border crossing get open so that happens.
You know, Ian, in watching our coverage over the weekend, this morning, even on 60 Minutes last night, I noticed that there seems to be a growing level of more overt criticism or frustration expressed about how the Israeli government or military appeared to be caught off guard by the attacks. Is that criticism likely to manifest in any way and calls for a change in leadership in the coming days or any other kind of political accountability? Or is this still sort of at a level of just general, what on earth happened? Why didn't they catch this before it started?
You know, Ed, I've covered this story for over a decade, and I can tell you, coming back to Israel this time, there's a different feeling here than in previous times, especially after a war or other sort of conflict. People here are genuinely angry. They're angry at, first and foremost, the prime minister and his government for allowing something like this to happen. You know, Israel has this legendary security apparatus, and it failed that day. Its intelligence failed, and that the result was over 1,000, over 1,300 Israelis were killed. And so people here want answers, and they do want accountability from their government. Right now, though, when you talk to Israelis, they say, first, they want to fight this war, and I think that's why we're seeing somewhat of this unity government with some members of the opposition coming into this war cabinet to wage this war against Hamas. But it seems like there will definitely be a reckoning, if it's not during this war, definitely afterwards. It reminds me back in 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, Golda Meir resigned because of that disastrous war. It's likely something similar could happen again. Ed?
We'll see. Ian Lee, to you and your team, thank you, and please stay safe. Here in Washington today, President Biden postponed a trip to Colorado in part to focus on national security meetings. Major Garrett joins us now. He is, of course, CBS News' chief Washington correspondent. They postponed that meeting also because there was a train derailment in the part of Colorado where he was headed to, and they didn't want to divert local resources. But it gave him an excuse to stay back and focus on this impending global crisis.
And make phone calls, as the president did, to the president of Egypt, the chancellor of Germany, efforts throughout the administration to build whatever coalition can be built in the immediate term, Ed, to deal with that Rafah border crossing. That's an Egyptian issue. The Egyptians have a lot of different questions to answer. They don't want a lot of Palestinians flowing across that for a couple of historical reasons. One, Egypt is not prepared to become a place for refugees en masse in the Sinai Peninsula. Two, it doesn't want Palestinians to leave Gaza not knowing if they'll ever return.
Right.
That's a complicating diplomatic issue there. The German chancellor is there about Europe and maintaining support for Israel in general, specifically about Hamas, but also to intensify whatever European efforts can be manifested to assist with whatever humanitarian gestures or relief can be provided, and waiting to see when and how Israel launches what all expect to be a decapitation military maneuver against Hamas in Gaza City.
Now, since it was first floated by Israeli news sources on Sunday, there has been chatter here in Washington, at least, that the president's going to make a visit to the Middle East this week. As someone who has covered presidents for a while, what is the risk-reward on a trip like this at a time when we're waiting for a ground offensive to begin? Does it even make sense for him to go? Or beyond expressing support for Israel, is it really worth it, I guess?
I think it's a very perilous maneuver for the president to go either right before or right after a ground offensive, because it places Americanism right next to that ground offensive.
Right.
America can support Israel, but America doesn't want to be perceived in that tight part of the region or throughout the Arab world as a bugle call to that ground invasion. And if the Israelis have signaled to the White House, and I only think that there would be conversations about this if it already had, it may be a while, and there are good reasons for Israel to plan this and plan this well. It can launch it on its terms. It doesn't have to go in right now. And the better it's planned and the better it's executed, the better it would be for the Netanyahu government. So I can't imagine the White House would even contemplate this, Ed, if they thought we were landing the day after it began.
Right.
Too perilous by far. Or leaving the day before it begins. There has to be some back, and I don't know, it's my sense of it very strongly, there have to be behind the scenes conversations that if you come, there'll be not a buffer zone necessarily, but a zone in which your arrival and exit will not be connected to whatever we do, meaning the Israelis militarily.
Especially if he has to make a stop somewhere in the Arab world as well.
Which you would have to think would have to happen.
Yeah. I want to play you something that transpired Sunday on Face the Nation between Governor Ron DeSantis, who of course is running for president, and Margaret Brennan regarding money for Israel and money, of course, for the Ukrainian conflict. If we can, let's take a look.
In the past, you've said you don't want a blank check to Ukraine. Do you want a blank check to Israel?
No, I think that there's actually two different things. One, with Israel, we've provided a lot of support since its inception, about $158 billion in the last 75 years. We've done over $120 billion just for Ukraine in 2 years. So it's a different level that we're talking about. Also with Israel, they've never asked us to displace their responsibility. They take their defense very seriously. What we do complements and supplements what they're already doing for themselves.
Part of why I wanted to play that is because it reflects a broader view among many conservative Republicans, who, of course, right now are still trying to figure out who's going to run the House of Representatives.
Correct.
But it gives a sense of where the debate on all this may be headed, as the White House has warned this week, maybe the week, they start asking for billions upon billions of dollars, not only for Israel, but also for Ukraine.
Right. Let's be clear. Under federal law right now, Israel receives $3 billion a year in military and economic assistance. That's guaranteed through 2028. Whatever the administration asked for will be in addition to that and for very specific Israeli needs related to this, Iron Dome and other things that may need to be reinforced. It's not part of the annual process. Ukraine is a different matter, and I think it's a distinction without a difference to say the United States supports Israel, but Israel takes care of its own defense. Ukraine was trying to take care of its own defense, except Russia invaded and is now training people on the fly, using military equipment provided by the United States and Europe on the fly to defend itself. It is very similar, but they're drawing a distinction because there's more support politically for Israel currently in the Republican conference in the House for sure than there is for Ukraine.
Yeah. And of course, first the House has to figure out its own politics.
Correct.
Right. Which is where we're headed next. But first, Major Garrett, thank you for being here. Happy Monday. Congressman Jim Jordan was nominated for House Speaker last Friday, but will he have enough votes to secure the top post in Congress? We'll discuss that next as you continue streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Ohio Republican Congressman Jim Jordan could be on the verge of becoming the next Speaker of the House. Could happen, as soon as Tuesday. But that's only if he can get the at least 217 votes needed to claim the gavel. Jordan was nominated last Friday, but needs the support of nearly all House Republicans. They've been searching to fill the top congressional post since ousting Congressman Kevin McCarthy of California almost 2 weeks ago. Who can forget? CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins us now from Capitol Hill. Scott, there has been movement in the direction of Jim Jordan today, suggesting he may be on the verge of doing it.
There's been a rapid coalescing around Jim Jordan. I spoke with one of his surrogates this morning who said this is going to happen. It's going to happen in short order. So that surrogate was either optimistic or prophetic, because we've seen some of the congressmen and congresswomen who either equivocated about Jim Jordan last week or said they're not going to support him. Today announced they're going to support him. Several of them made those announcements either on Twitter, now known as X, or to media interviews in their home districts or here in Washington, D.C. One of the surrogates for Jim Jordan says the leverage applied was effective, that these members of Congress who were uncertain about Jim Jordan were hearing from conservative activists who show up in primaries. And these are just some of the individuals who today announced their support for Jim Jordan. And when it comes to these leadership races, Ed, you know this, it's contagious. When people start shifting in the direction others are inclined to follow. And if they're going to do this, as promised, at 12 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, a public roll call vote, it gets more and more difficult to be a dissenter, to be a contrarian when your numbers are thin. We caught up with Jim Jordan late this afternoon, who said he is particularly optimistic about tomorrow. Take a listen.
You got to have the House open to do the work of the American people. You can't get the House open until you have a speaker. So I think it's going to happen tomorrow.
Do you think you have enough votes to reach 217 on the first round?
I think so.
And if you don't, what happens?
Vote again.
Just to set the stage, Ed, Democrats remain unified behind Hakeem Jeffries of New York. This is not going to be a bipartisan coalition, but Jim Jordan, who can lose only 4 or 5 members of his House Republican conference, is getting very close to that magic number.
He is, in part because I want to put back up those baseball cards of the 4 or 5 now that say they're with him. It includes Vern Buchanan of Florida, Ann Wagner of Missouri, Ken Calvert of California. Remind the audience why votes like these matter.
Well, Vern Buchanan, I spoke to him Friday. The Florida congressman has been around here for nearly 2 decades, was telling me he's looking for other candidates. He's looking for somebody else. So him flipping this quickly builds momentum for Jim Jordan. But Mike Rogers and Ken Calvert have a unique distinction. They are both on high-ranking committees in impactful places. Mike Rogers chairs the Armed Services Committee. Ken Calvert is what they call a cardinal, a chairman of an appropriations subcommittee. They have unique heft because of those positions, but also some of the concern, Ed, was about Jim Jordan potentially not supporting more financial aid for Ukraine. Mike Rogers and Ken Calvert getting on board indicates Jim Jordan might, in fact, be supportive of their views on Ukraine funding.
I thought the Mike Rogers development probably was the biggest tell today. You're right, because there had been this concern about national security or seriousness when it comes to that and putting up the money needed to back up the rhetoric that we've seen from all sides regarding Israel especially, but also Ukraine beyond that. You heard Jim Jordan there do the schoolhouse rock on what happens if he doesn't win. Who else is in the wings if he doesn't at this point, and how many more rounds would it go?
That's really telling, Ed. We haven't heard another name surface. We were expecting one today because it appeared Jim Jordan's hold on this nomination was uniquely fragile after winning it by just a narrow margin last week and winning it over somebody who didn't announce his candidacy until minutes before the vote. Without hearing that second name, there's a vacuum there. Of course, anybody who wants to dissent from Jim Jordan can just pick a name of somebody. It can be Santa Claus, it can be Mickey Mouse, it could be another member of the House Republican Conference. But that there's no second candidate means there's nobody else to coalesce behind, which gives Jim Jordan more leverage ahead of tomorrow.
You think he's joking? He's not, because anyone can be nominated House Speaker, right? You don't have to be a member of the House. There is another matter you were tracking down the street from where you stand right now, and that is the potential for a gag order on former President Donald Trump in the federal case brought by the special prosecutor Jack Smith. There was a bit of a ruling this afternoon that set some boundaries.
A big early round victory, Ed, for the special counsel, Jack Smith. Not only did the judge in the case, Tanya Chutkin, say publicly in court she's sticking with that March 4th trial date she set. She is not delaying this case, and she's not delaying it past the election. That's a win for Jack Smith, even though it was a bit of a footnote in today's hearing. The bigger picture was the gag order she put in place effective immediately, limiting what Trump can say, targeting 3 different groups of people. Jack Smith and his family, the special counsel. She took special objection, she says, to Trump calling him a thug. The judge says any other criminal defendant using the phrase thug targeted towards authorities would likely face sanctions. Also can't make statements about witnesses in the case. That could include Bill Barr, General Mark Milley, Mike Pence, Brad Raffensperger. And she says Trump can't be invoking or targeting court staff, the prosecutors, or the judge herself. And she referenced the incident a few weeks ago where Trump was alleged to have posted a photo of a staffer of a New York judge handling one of his cases. She says all of this shows you have limits to your First Amendment rights when you're a criminal defendant. Ed, the defense was counterpunching, trying to fight back at this gag order and saying, why should Trump be limited if Joe Biden and Hunter Biden aren't limited in what they can say? And the judge says Hunter Biden and Joe Biden are not criminal defendants in this court.
So they cannot do all those things. I think we have a list of what he still can do as well that we should show people, because this speaks to a lot of what voters have been hearing from him over the last several, literally for more than a year, saying he can be unfairly prosecuted. He can criticize the Biden administration and the Justice Department. He can assert his belief that this is all politically motivated and continue to fundraise off of it, basically. It's those more specific restrictions now in place that really will test his ability, for lack of a better description, to keep his mouth shut, at least when it comes to those specific concerns.
The judge was pretty clear here, and the prosecutors made the same argument that she doesn't want Trump chilling future witnesses, threatening, harassing current witnesses. They don't want to limit his campaign speech. I mean, everybody's acknowledging he's a candidate, a front runner. His opponent would be President Biden. The judge says we can't stop him from criticizing the Biden administration. Judge even said you don't have to stop, if you're Donald Trump, criticizing the District of Columbia, which he called filthy and crime-ridden. The judge says if that taints the jury pool, jury selection can weed out somebody who may be adversely impacted, but not witnesses. Not the authorities, not the special prosecutor, the judge, or the judge's staff. All of that, the judge says, can be deemed threatening and a breach of the administration of justice, which she says gives her the foundation for this ruling.
Fascinating that they were making the what about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden argument in a court of law when that's more of a court of public opinion issue. But obviously the judge there struck it down. Scott McFarland, you have a busy week ahead of you on multiple fronts. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Ed.
Former President Trump is campaigning in Iowa today. What he had to say about that gag order Israel, and more coming up as you continue streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. While voting in Iowa's Republican caucus doesn't happen for another 91 days, we've got a new way to gauge support for those running for president. Contenders in both parties released their latest quarterly fundraising numbers over the weekend. President Biden and the Democratic National Committee raised a combined $71 million from the quarter running July through September. That gives them about $91 million total on hand to spend as needed. Former President Donald Trump led the GOP in the cash race, too, raising $45.5 million with his PAC. He now has $37.5 million in his campaign account. Either way you look at it, plenty of money to go around, at least for the frontrunners. CBS News campaign reporter Torian Small joins us now from Adel, Iowa, where the former president is campaigning today. Torian, good to see you. While it's obviously less than the sitting president's total, how does Donald Trump's third quarter fundraising compare to the other GOP candidates?
Yeah, Ed, I want to underscore really that last figure that you brought up with the former president, $37.5 million cash on hand. To put that into perspective, that's about 7 times more than his closest rival, that's Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and about 3 times more than UN Ambassador Nikki Haley and U.S. Senator from South Carolina Tim Scott. Now, Trump is really finding success in touting his legal woes as really effective donating techniques. We even saw today he sent out a campaign blast to his donors, slamming the gag order issued by a federal judge in his 2020 election case.
In fact, we have some sound of what he had to say about it himself there in Adel, Iowa this afternoon. Let's take a listen.
I'll be the only politician in history that runs with a gag order where I'm not allowed to criticize people. Can you imagine this? Do you believe this? I'm not allowed to criticize people, so we'll see. We'll appeal it.
So that's his impression of things. How are his supporters responding to the gag order and his legal issues generally?
Yeah, what's interesting, he spent a good amount of time talking about the gag order without actually talking about it. He just said he can't say much because he's the only politician in history to be under this gag order, and then rounded it out by saying they'll be appealing that decision very soon. But his supporters are taking to the president, really expressing sympathy for him. I talked to quite a few voters here in Iowa who said that they believe, like the president has said, that this is a witch hunt, and they don't believe any of the charges or the indictments rather against the former president.
So they agree with what he has been conveying. Now, this is his second visit, the former president's, to Iowa in a little over a week, and his 9th during this election cycle, far fewer than other contenders on the Republican side. Does his team think he's doing enough to actually win the caucus in January?
Well, we're getting word that he'll spend more time in Iowa. He's doing 2 events today, started in Adel, and then he headed to Clyde for a rally there. But they believe that, you know, starting strong by going out to these caucus events, putting his face out there, could build up that momentum. He finished 2nd in 2016, so he's looking to start strong, finish first this time around, raise more money to keep him in the running.
All right, Torian Small, a member of the CBS News Class of 2024 reporting team. We will see much more of you there in the Hawkeye State in the 91 days or so to go. We thank you, and we'll be talking to you again soon. That does it for today. Thank you for watching. You can stream America Decides Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. You're streaming CBS News.